E is equal mc squared.
Hi everyone, good morning, soon good afternoon. It's a gorgeous day. It's also a very special day because today is June 21st, is a summer solstice. It's also strawberry full moon. And I was told that this combination of things happens every either 16 years or 30 years. It's a really unique, special day. And we'll have a whole day of celebrating, food for thought, for the stomach, for the soul, for the heart, great activities. So it's great to be among some new friends and also some old friends that I haven't seen since some bars during the global financial crisis. There was a time when I got my nickname Dr. Doom because I predict the global financial crisis. I recently published a new book. It's titled Mega Threats. Threats, not trends. It's mega, not MAGA and not meta. Mega, mega large, big. And the subtitle is 10 Dangerous Trends that imperil our future and how to survive them. And I don't talk only about economic, monetary, and financial risk like I did during the global financial crisis. And I talk also about social, political, geopolitical, environmental, health, technological, demographic risk as well. So 10 years ago, with the global financial crisis was Dr. Doom because I predicted the end of the economy and the markets. Today somebody told me you're not Dr. Doom anymore, you're Dr. Apocalypse because you're predicting the end of the world. World War III, climate change, pandemics, social political collapse, lots of other ugly stuff. Now it feels weird because we're in this beautiful place, this paradise island where everybody tries to find themselves, to be healthy, in your mind, your body, your heart, your soul, on this special day. And this looks like a paradise. I mean, we could be in any better place than this, not just the nature, but also the human, the people who live here, and they want to change the world for the better. So it looks like a bucolic, idyllic paradise, but unfortunately, we live and we have to be aware of it, that right across, if you go to the continent, lots of ugly things are happening. There are lots of risks, there are lots of threats, there are lots of uncertainties. And some of them are global, like global climate change. Some of them are regional or local, like I'm going to go to Paris from here, where now maybe Le Pen is going to win the election and she may become president 3 years from now, and she might run the government in 3 weeks. And some of the issues are even very, very local. I mean, look like the most beautiful and safest place in the world. But I was reading some prediction about climate change. And under the most extreme scenario, this island will be so hot for so many months of the year that you'll have what people call the wet bulb phenomenon. That when the heat is above 40 degrees and there's too much humidity, you cannot be anymore outside because essentially the water in your lung expands and you cannot even breathe. This is already happening in the Gulf a couple of months a year. In places like Dubai, it could happen here. If climate change occurs and sea level rises, by the end of this century it could rise by, they say, 10 feet. But if there is a non-linear phenomenon like an ice sheet in Antarctica or in Greenland where to crack down and fall in the water, could have sea level rising not at the end of this century, but 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and people now say those kind of non-linearity will occur. And think about that 40% of the world, people live near coastal areas. I live in New York City. It's all at water level. It was a Sunday storm. Half of New York was flooded. Lots of properties that are the most expensive here are the water level. They could be totally flooded into that case. I was just in California, and there are wildfires every summer because it gets too hot, and then because of the heat, things burn. It happens in Greece, it happens in Italy, it happens in Spain, it happens here. So that's think about the risk of climate change to a place like this. Now, in 2020, we all went through COVID, and I think everybody could tell a story about how their life completely got disrupted and changed by COVID. This was a paradise of tourism. Everything shut down at least for a year. Until then, people come and decide to live here. But it was shut down. People were in music, performers. You couldn't do anything. I know so many friends in arts and entertainment in New York. Their lives and their livelihood were completely destroyed by COVID. COVID occurred. I'll tell you why it happened again, even worse. And we also live in a world in which there are these geopolitical risks. There's this ugly war with the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. For now, it's local, but there are scenarios in which NATO could get involved, in which the war could become unconventional, and both sides could use unconventional weapons like nuclear weapons. And there are already people talking about the risk of World War III. Now, if World War III were to occur, it's not just a nuclear bomb going to Washington, New York, Beijing, and Moscow. They'll go to London, they'll go to Paris, they'll go to Madrid. And that nuclear fallout is going to destroy everything, even this island. Once you have a nuclear winter, it affects everybody. Now, this thing, it looked like a little bit on the scary side, but the reality is as follows. We live in a world in which we live into what I call unusual, unprecedented, unexpected uncertainty. 4 U's: unusual, unprecedented, unexpected uncertainty. I was just last month in Korea, conference organized by their government. The president spoke. The title of the conference was the era of hyper uncertainty. We have never had so many types of uncertainty, because it's not just the traditional economic ones, but as I said, social, political, geopolitical, environmental, health, stuff that did not happen. When was the last time we saw a major global pandemic? Spanish flu, 1918-19, and until the 1980s, and we never had them again. People didn't even think about pandemics. Just to give you an idea of the kind of uncertainty. Now, the good news is the following one. Some people speak about what people refer to as unknown unknowns, stuff that nobody could even imagine. 9/11 was an unknown unknown. Would have thought that 20 terrorists are going to take planes and going to hit the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. I was that morning in New York going to school and teach, and I saw them hitting and then going down. That's an unknown unknown. It's what people call a black swan event, something so extreme that you cannot even think about it, and you cannot even price it, and so on. I'm not talking about unknown unknowns. In my book, I don't talk about the risk of an asteroid, for example, hitting planet Earth, and that's a possibility, low probability. I don't talk about aliens coming and taking over planet Earth. Those are things that may or may not occur, but they are things under which we have very little control. I talk instead about known risk, what people call known unknowns, as opposed to unknown unknowns. Economic, monetary, financial risk, and other ones that we talked about, and I'll discuss them. So it's about stuff that is happening right now and could become worse in the years ahead. Now, let me make the following observation. Some of what I'm going to say may be a little bit slightly more technical. Some of you are in finance, in business. Some of you are actually great human beings in art, in culture, in other things. So I'm going to try to be as little technical as I can, because some of it might be a little bit over your head. But I have to talk about stuff that is somehow complicated. It's not the usual subject matter. But I'll make the following observation that probably reflects each of us as well. Even if you look at what people refer to as the economic, monetary, and financial risks, stuff that people write about, the world today is radically different from the world that existed before COVID. Really, there's been a regime change. Before COVID, people talked about the Great Moderation, a period of time where inflation was low, around 2%, growth was stable, you didn't have major economic downturn, you didn't have major economic crisis, the stock prices were rising over time, up and down, but rising. So people call it the Great Moderation from 1990 until the global financial crisis. Even after the global financial crisis, we live in a world of what people call secular stagnation. Growth was low, the recovery from the financial crisis was weak, inflation was below 2%, and central banks were doing all these unconventional things, zero policy rates, negative policy rates, quantitative easing, to try to boost growth and lead inflation to 2%. So it was a world of low growth and low inflation, and still okay rising asset prices. That world that people call the Great Moderation, or the secular stagnation, I'll argue is over. And we're entering a new regime of what people refer to as the Great, not secular stagnation, but secular stagflation. Stagflation means low growth and high inflation. Most of you are too young to remember. I'm old enough. In the 1970s. 73, there is the Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arab states on the same, literally, time almost as the October 7 event. It was also a surprise. Because of this war, there was an embargo of oil by Saudi Arabia and other Arab states. Oil prices tripled, inflation went to double digit, and we had a severe recession, and unemployment in US, Europe, Japan went to 10%. Stagflation, stagnation, and inflation. It happened again in 1979. Iranian Revolution, the Islamists come to power, shut down production, export of oil spikes, again doubles, and you had recession and inflation in 80 and 82. So that's what is stagflation. We're going back to a world that we have not seen since the 70s, where inflation is going to be higher, growth is going to be lower, and stock prices are going higher over time. They could correct downward. That's a risk we're facing. Why I say that this world is economically and monetary financially different from before COVID? Think about some of these differences. Difference number one, before COVID, everybody worried that inflation was too low. People talked about deflation or lowflation, zero inflation, negative inflation. A year ago, inflation in the US and Europe was 10%, went from below close to zero to 10% right after COVID. So now we have to worry not about inflation being too low, we have to worry about inflation being too high. And inflation being high means that cost of everything, of home, of food, of energy, of everything you buy is higher. Everybody has been squeezed by 10% inflation for the last 2 or 3 years, whether you're rich, middle class, or less so. Inflation is a big problem. So now is the new world. As I pointed out, and I'll explain in more detail, secular stagnation, that was low growth, low inflation, low investment, high saving, that world is over. We are going to be in secular stagflation, low growth with high inflation and higher unemployment, and with not enough savings, and with inflationary pressure rather than inflationary. Third difference, everybody before COVID complained about this unconventional monetary policy. Central banks were doing crazy things that never had done before. Zero interest rates, negative policy rates, quantitative easing, buying long-term bonds, credit easing, stuff that was very, very unconventional. Today, instead, we have normalized policy rates. US, the Fed fund rate has gone from 0 to what? 5.5. In Europe, it went from negative to 4.5. People, instead of doing quantitative easing, are doing quantitative tightening. They're selling those bonds. That pushes up the price or the yield on long-term bonds. A few years ago, people were complaining that interest rates were low. If you're a saver, if you're a creditor, you're earning zero on your cash. You're earning almost zero on your long-term bonds. So people said we're screwing the creditors and the savers by doing this unconventional monetary policy. In Europe and Japan, for 10 years, there were $20 trillion of public debt that the return at 10 years was negative nominal. You get less money back than we did. You had no nominal interest. Mortgages in Scandinavia, long-term mortgages at negative interest rate. You buy a home, you get a mortgage, you pay negative interest rate. This was happening 4 years ago, if you remember, that world. That world is over. We have normalized policy rates. Short-term rates are 5.5 or more in the US. Long rates are 4 to 5%. And now people are complaining. The savers are earning money, but those who are borrowers, those who are debtors, if you have to have a mortgage, if you have an auto loan, a student loan, a credit card, if you're a business, you borrow, either from a bank or a capital market, if you're a government, if you're a country, now you have high interest rates. And now we're helping the savers and we're putting in trouble those that are borrowers and debtors. Related to that, before COVID, the amount of debt in the world, private and public debt of households, debt of businesses, of corporations, of banks, financial institutions, of government country was huge. Before COVID, the ratio of private and public debt as a share of GDP income was globally about 300%. In advanced economy was 400%. In China was 330. But while debts were very, very high, almost nobody was going bankrupt. Why? Because interest rates were zero. You could borrow at zero on the short end, you could borrow a mortgage close to zero. So while you had a lot of debt, even zombie households, corporation, businesses, government, country survived. Because with zero interest rates, the debt servicing cost, that is interest you pay on that debt, was very petty. Today, in the US alone, you want to get a 10-year mortgage, has gone from 3% to above 7%. Who can get a mortgage? That's why the housing market is down. Same thing on auto loans, credit cards. If you borrow from a bank as a business, if you're a government, you borrowed at zero. 4 years ago, now you borrow at 5.5, short or long. So if you're a government with too much debt, you're going to go bankrupt over time. Now, it's not going to happen as well. So the world is one in which if you have too much debt, and now you have these interest rates, default, risk, bankruptcy, resolution of these things. Another difference, everybody a few years ago was complaining about hyper globalization. There is too much trade in goods, in services, too much movement of capital, too much migration of labor, too much movement of data, information, technology. It was not just globalization when 2.5 billion Chinese and Indian, Chinas joined the global labor supply, or the Soviet Union collapsed, and then you had all these countries also joining the global economy. It was massive hyper-globalization, more trade in everything, goods, services, capital, labor, technology, data, information. Today is the opposite. Everybody's talking about what? Deglobalization, decoupling, de-risking, protectionism. We have to protect our own firms, our own workers. We're scared about China. We have to de-risk it. We have fragmentation of the global economy. We have balkanization of global supply chains. We used to be in favor of free trade. Then we said we're in favor of fair trade. Now we're in favor of secure trade. We used to do offshoring to China. Now we want to reshore to US and Europe, or we want to friendshore to friendly countries like India or Mexico or Thailand or Vietnam. We used to care about economic efficiency, where you should allocate your capital at the lowest cost in the best country. Now you have to worry about economic and national security. That as a cost. We used to have just-in-time global supply chains. Today, everybody talking about just-in-case, China +1. If you are all your basket in China, you're at risk. You have to do at least some other country, just in case rather than just in time. We went from laissez-faire free markets to now talking about protectionism, about industrial policy, about subsidies, about defending our national champions. We went from under-regulating to now wanting to over-regulate. So the entire world of globalization is upside down, with consequences that I'll discuss, but they are important. Another thing that people that work on commodity notice, after the global financial crisis, commodity prices, oil, energy, food, green metals, industrial metal, the price of them collapsed by 50%. Literally, the price of all commodities collapsed because there was not enough demand in the world. There was not enough growth. Demand for commodity was low. And that fall in commodity prices was bad news for the commodity exporters, but any country that, like in Europe, you buy energy, you buy food, you buy other things, prices of all these goods were cheap, and inflation because of that was low. Since COVID, the average price of commodities has more than doubled. Literally more than doubled. Energy, food, industrial metal, fertilizer. Some of it was a shock following the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, where there was a shock to energy, shock to exports of food, fertilizer, and industrial metal. But even now that that shock has gone away, commodity prices are very, very high. Cocoa, we had a cocoa ceremony. The price of cocoa in the last 2 years has tripled. Chocolate is fucking expensive. Just simple example of stuff that you go buy a Mars chocolate bar, it costs you 3 times as much as it did 3 years ago. And so on for everything across the board. Why that's the case and what are the consequences? The fact that inflation is high and persistent is in part because commodity prices are high. And of course, there was a war in the Middle East, and you have a shutdown of the Gulf, like 73 or 79, you could have another spike in oil prices, and then you have inflation, you have recession, like 73, like 79. Another difference, a few years ago, the major global reserve currency that was used in trade and payment was the US dollar. About 3/4 of reserves, of payments internationally, of invoicing happens with the US dollar. And people said, well, it's a system based on the US dollar, we don't like it, and we want an alternative. But my former advisor at Harvard, and I worked for him when he was Secretary of the Treasury, I spent 2 years in Washington, Larry Summers, he made a joke. He said, people don't like the US dollar, they want something else, but you cannot replace something with nothing. And he says, if you don't like the dollar, what's the alternative? And he made a joke, he said, Europe is a museum. China, RMB, China is a prison. Yen in Japan, Japan is a nursing home. Crypto and Bitcoin is a failing experiment. So people did not like the US dollar, but what was the alternative? You cannot replace something with nothing. It's like the beauty contest where the issue is not who is the prettiest, but who is the least ugly. The US and the dollar were the least ugly. It's like being the valedictorian in summer school. Anybody could become valedictorian in summer school. We were the less dirty shirt in a very dirty laundry bag. So no alternative. But today, everybody's talking about the dollarization. Of course, the rivals of the US that impose sanctions, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they're already de-dollarizing and they're worried about it. But even the Brazils of the world or the Saudis of the world say, if the US imposes sanction on China and we don't follow them, they can impose sanction on us. So should we keep all these dollars? So everybody's talking about de-dollarization. It's not yet happening, but it's a revolution. So the world of economic, monetary, and financial is those of you who are doing business, doing finance, doing investment. The world of your own investment, of your risk today is in 8, 10 different ways. I'll give you some example. Very, very different from what it was even 4 years ago before COVID. Some of it is technical, but those who are in business will realize it. But let me talk about stuff that actually is more related to what everybody can relate to, is the non-economic risks and how they merge. In my book, I speak about 10 economic and non-economic risks that feed on each other. It's like a matrix where each one of these risks affect the other one and vice versa. It's like a 10 by 10 matrix. You cannot understand any more economics, finance, and monetary affair unless you understand social trends, political trends, geopolitical trends, demographic trends, technological, environmental, health, COVID. Those are things that matter and they feed on each other. Let me talk about some of these non-economic and why we should worry about them. First of all, number one, we live in a world of what people refer to as geopolitical depression. There are geopolitical rivalries, and there is a number of revisionist powers, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, some people add to it Pakistan and a few others, that challenge the economic, monetary, financial, trading, social, political, geopolitical, security, military order that the US, Europe, Japan, their friends and allies around the world created after World War II. That global international liberal order of democracy and markets is being challenged, but people want a totally different system from ours. And that is leading to hot wars. There's a hot war today between Ukraine and Russia, given the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. It can get uglier. It's not over. It's getting worse. Could become unconventional. Could involve NATO. There's today a hot war between Israel and Hamas on the issue of Gaza. Forget about your views on it, who's right, who's wrong. I'm not going to go into it. It's a war. And the war is getting ugly. And it could expand this month to Hezbollah, that is a proxy of Iran in Lebanon. It could lead Israel to attack Iran. It could become regional. And if it becomes regional, the kind of shock that happened in 73, Yom Kippur War, 79, Iranian Revolution, with a shock to oil price. Suppose that there's a war between Israel and Iran. Rockets are being launched all over the Gulf. There's not going to be a single tanker can get out of the Gulf. You shut down production and export. Oil prices triple. You'll have inflation and recession, stagflation, like 73, 74, 75, like 1979 to until 82. It's a material risk. You cannot worry about it. So, hot wars, Russia-Ukraine, hot war between Israel and Hamas, that is a proxy of a bigger war with Iran. You have a Cold War between US and China, and this Cold War is getting colder. I wrote a whole trip report on China. I'm not going to bother you. But you read the news. US imposes sanction, trade sanction, technological sanction, financial sanction against China. China threatens to retaliate. This is a Cold War that's economic. It's also geopolitical. China is expanding its power, wants to regain Taiwan, reunify, either peacefully or otherwise. It has claims against the Philippines, against Indonesia, against Malaysia, against Japan, against everybody. And this Cold War is getting colder. And the Cold War, eventually, on the issue of Taiwan, could become a hot war. People are now doing war game scenarios where they're saying not whether, but when is US and China are going to have a hot war on the issue of Taiwan. People say within this decade, because Xi Jinping is coming to power, not because he wants to reform China. He wants to pass to history, and he's already in his 70s. He can rule for another 10 years, as the man who reunified mainland with Taiwan, because that's a big blot in Chinese history. For them, it's an offense, it's a shame. And until we reunify, that's not going to be enough. You could have a war. And if that war occurs, the proxy wars between the rivals, some people say World War III has already started. It started in Russia, Ukraine. It started in the Middle East, because they're all proxy wars of a bigger conflict in US and China. Revisionist powers, who are they? Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Even the little dictator in Pyongyang keeps on sending rockets. I was in Korea last month, and the Koreans and the Japanese are scared. World War II did not start on a day. It was an escalation of things for several years that then led to 1939. What has happened in Russia, Ukraine, what has happened in Israel and Hamas could be the beginning of a domino that leads to something bigger. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's a threat. Now, some risks are geopolitical directly, but what's the biggest geopolitical risk this year? The biggest geopolitical risk this year is the results of the US election. Now, I'm not going to be partisan, Biden versus Trump, but some people like Trump. I happen to be a Democrat, but let's be not partisan. If Trump is elected, he has a very different view of, say, Biden on Russia and Ukraine. He has a very different view of Biden on how to confront China. He has a very different view of Biden about how to deal with the Middle East. He has announced he's going to impose 10% tariffs on all the goods that are imported to the US. Doesn't matter whether it's from Spain, Europe, from allies like Japan, Korea, or from rivals. And the rivals, he says, I'm going to impose 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. Think of it. Tariffs right now are averaging 2% for the US. You go from 2 to 10, and you go from China from 10 to 60. The price of everything is imported in the US is going to double or triple, and you're going to have inflation. He's meaning it. He's worried about our trade deficit. He blames it on China. The risk of a trade war, if he's elected, is there. Will he support NATO? Will he support Europe? Will he support Ukraine? Will he do something about the Middle East, like ignoring it? Will he become more aggressive on China? Whether you like him or you don't like him, a presence, you go around the world, and I go everywhere around the world, the first question everybody is asking me is, one, who's going to win the US election? Literally, who's going to win the US election? And if Trump wins, what's going to be his policies? It's on everybody's mind, because what the US does affects the entire world, whether you like it or not. So the US elections are actually one of the biggest risks of uncertainty, political and geopolitical today in the world. And it could lead to greater confrontation rather than less confrontation. So global rivalry, hot wars, they're getting hotter. Cold wars are getting colder, could become hotter. Second problem, entire books have been written about it, and some people know about it much more than I do. I have a chapter in my book about climate change, global climate change. Now, we could spend hours talking about it, but I'll make the following observation. Every year there's this COP meeting. 3 years ago was in Sharm el-Sheikh. Then they did it in Glasgow. This year was in Dubai. Every year they make promises, government, corporation, and so on, we're going to achieve net zero. There is so much greenwashing. There is so much greenwashing. Sorry to say, most of it is bullshit. It's not the scientists in the corporation that make those zero plans. It's their PR department, their communication, say we have a plan for net zero. Even the oil companies say we have a net zero plan. What a joke when they're producing even more fossil fuels. So it's greenwashing, it's greenwishing. Even if it's a big if, everything that was promised at COP, Sharm el-Sheikh, Glasgow, Dubai, were to be implemented, and it's a huge if, scientists said that we're already today at 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial level. Today, last summer was that hot. This summer is going to be hotter. We are going to for sure get to 2, and given the current commitment, it's not 1.5, it's not 2, it's 2.4. And 1.5 is already leading every summer to typhoons, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, sea level rising, storms, desertification, collapse of agriculture, you name it. Every day there's a story of something happening. These are not natural disasters. They call them natural, nothing natural about them. They're man-made. It's climate change. And it's going to get worse every single day. The entire Europe was burning last summer because of the heat. This island is going to be too hot for most people. Unfortunately, some of you live here, they have homes here. If things don't change, you're not going to be able to survive here. It's going to be burning hot 6 months a year in a way that you cannot live here. That's a risk everywhere. So we're doing a lot of talk, but most of it is greenwashing, greenwishing, and greenflation. I'm not going to say much more right now, but if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Pandemic, global pandemic, we had COVID-19. Unfortunately, COVID-19 is not going to be the last one of this global pandemic, and it's not going to be the most virulent. And ask yourself the following question. When was the last real great global pandemic? Most of us don't remember. I remember because I studied in a history book, was the Spanish flu. But it was not in Spain, it started in the US, but it's called Spanish for another reason. 1918 and 1919, slightly 105 years ago, okay? That's why most people didn't even know. I mean, in the history book, there was a mention after World War I, there was a Spanish flu. And until 1980s, there was literally no global pandemic. Guess what? What has happened since 1980? HIV, SARS, MERS, swine flu, repeated episodes of bird flu, Zika, Ebola, now COVID-19. Why suddenly, between 1920 and 1980, there is none, and since 1980, there's been escalation of them, more virulent, more frequent, more whatever else. Turns out that there's actually a link between global climate change and pandemic. And the link is as follows. As we encroach on the animal ecosystem through urbanization and destroying the Amazons and the forest, it turns out that those animals that carry pathogens, pangolin, bats, and others, get closer and closer, one to livestock animal in the farms and to human beings. And these diseases, what are they called? They're called zoonotic diseases. What zoonotic means? Zoo means that goes from animal to human. That's what it means. A transmission goes from animal to animal. Who cares? They die. It's animal to human. And once it's animal to human, it becomes a pandemic and become potentially a global pandemic. So as we destroy the planet, we destroy the habitat of these animals. These animals have pathogens that get closer to us. And that's why these things are happening over and over again. It's not, again, a natural disaster. It's man-made. That's what's happening. Another example of how pandemic and global climate change are related. Because of global climate change, everywhere that you have the permafrost, like Siberia is mostly permafrost. The permafrost is essentially melting down. Two things are happening. One is that there's a huge amount of methane that is under the permafrost frozen. It's a bit like when you do the flaring of natural gas, when you do fracking. All this methane comes out, they burn it, and it goes into the atmosphere. All this methane, as the defrosting occurs, is going to come out. And methane, for those of you who don't know, has 10 times more greenhouse gas emission than CO2. CO2 is terrible, fossil fuels. Methane is 10 times worse. So you have all these methanes now going in the atmosphere. Two, there are all these bacteria and viruses that have been frozen in the permafrost for thousands, if not millions of years. I mean, freaky stuff we don't even know, much worse than COVID-19. They just found in Greenland, because of defrosting, some bacteria that are really weird. Suppose that some of them comes and is worse than COVID, then COVID is going to look like a cakewalk compared to that kind of shit. It could happen. And this is science. This is not just things like this. As I said, the risk that the ice sheet in Antarctica or Greenland is going to fall in the water and it's going to sea rise level of 10 feet in 3 months, not in 50 years, is a material risk that you have to start to think about. So pandemics are not a natural disaster. Natural disaster in nature are not natural disaster. It's climate change connected with pandemic, feeding on each other. And therefore, these things are going to become more frequent, more virulent, more dangerous. Get ready for it, okay? We got lucky, we got the vaccine in a year. Next time around, we might not be this lucky. Demographics is important. People say the most important thing in the world is demographic. We live in a planet today where there are 8 billion people. 100 years ago was 2 billion of us. Now we've gone from 2 to 8. Given current trend, by the end of this century, there'll be 10 billion of us. But guess what? Less people in America, less people in Europe, less people in Japan. All advanced economies, fertility rates are falling, people don't have as much children, so population, unless you have migration, is falling. But also some major emerging markets are now having declining in population. China, Russia, Taiwan, South Korea, for lots of reasons. So population is falling in the rich countries, but where is it going up? The population of Africa is going to descend to go from 1 billion to 2 billion. Poor countries in Southeast Asia are going to go up. Some of the Middle Eastern are going up, some parts of Latin America. So the rich countries have less population, the poor countries have more population. Today, take Africa, a continent of 54 countries. Some of them are very fragile, some of them are failed states. 1 billion people, you don't have enough education, health, skills to give jobs to people. There is a famine today in Ethiopia. You don't have enough food to feed 1 billion people. With climate change, where there is desertification, lack of water, lots of sub-Saharan Africa is collapsing. You have collapse of agriculture, people move to the cities, you have conflict, civil war, economic collapse, political, and then where do they go? They all go to Europe. They all try to move to Europe. Europe is lucky for the following reason. There are millions and millions of North African from Sub-Saharan Africa and from Middle East and Afghanistan want to go to Europe. What has Europe done for the last few years? Has given money to Turkey, keep them in Turkey, the Syrian and Afghans. Has given money to Egypt, to Libya, to Tunisia. Say keep those Southern African ones there, because otherwise you'll have not 1 million people like 2015, where was a political crisis, could have 10, 20 million people per year trying to get into Europe. And by the way, Europe and Mediterranean is a shallow, short, small sea. If you are in Asia and you want to go from, say, Indonesia to Australia, is 10-hour of flight, is stormy seas and oceans, you have typhoons and things of that sort. In Europe, you cross from Turkey to Lesbos, is 5 miles, and you're already in Greece and Europe. Pantelleria is only 50 miles away from the North African coast. So this collapse of economies, these demographic changes were time bombs. There's a scenario in which if climate change becomes worse, according to this trend, there'll be 3 out of these 8 billion people who can live in parts of the world where you cannot survive. Either it's too hot, or it's flooded, or there's no agriculture. You have 3 billion people have to move somewhere else. We got panicked 10 years ago in Europe because 1 million people from Syria and from Afghanistan wanted to come to Europe, and we said, sorry, you're not allowed to. In the US now, the election is going to be based on migration restriction. Trump is beating on Biden, saying you're lying, all these bad hombres. They're all criminal, they're all rapists, they're all whatever. I mean, it's stupid stuff. But that's the rhetoric. And now even Biden has done an executive order, shut down the border. Sorry, you cannot get in. And 2 million people a year enter the United States. At the peak was 1 million from Middle East and so on coming into Europe. And we could not handle it. Wait until you have 3 billion people knocking on the doors of Europe and US. What are you going to do? If you don't let them in, they're going to starve. If you let them in, how are you going to feed them all? And this is what's happening with climate change. So demographics implies that there is massive migration, like it has happened for the last 30, 40 years, from south to north, from poor to rich. But when things were normal times, we could accept 1-2 million people a year into the US, land of opportunity, even in Europe. Now there's a backlash against it. Why Le Pen is going to win those elections? Because she says 20% of French are North African, they're Muslim, they don't accept our secular state, they don't accept our tradition, we should kick them out. No migration. Those kind of things. Trump may get elected because one of the biggest weaknesses of Biden is not the economy is doing well, actually, isn't the migration thing. It's becoming politically charged, and all these populist parties of the extreme right are saying, damn foreigners, keep them out. It's becoming the most politically hot question in a world where actually people are starving, are burning, and they have nowhere to go and they have to move. And we say, sorry, we're not going to let you in. Think about this world and it's going to get worse. Fourth non-economic factor. Everywhere around the world, you see this backlash against liberal democracy and democratic capitalism. Whether in the US, whether it's in Europe, whether it's an emerging market, you have the rise of extreme populist parties that are populist, that are authoritarian, and they're aggressive. Aggressive, like the case of Putin, right? He was weak at home, he finds a wag the dog excuse to go and destroy Ukraine. China could react to a domestic problem by attacking Taiwan. It's always like this. If you're weak at home, you find a foreign enemy to try to distract. Populist, authoritarian become aggressive. World War II started because you had Nazis in Germany, fascists in Italy, authoritarian in Japan, and Franco in Spain. Those were four fascist, authoritarian, aggressive, populist regime that decided to go to war. That's what happened. We live in a world in which advanced economies, you had Trump in the United States, you had until recently Boris Johnson in the UK, you have Orban in Hungary, you have Meloni in Italy, you're going to have Le Pen soon. These neo-Nazis won the election and they're going to be part of the coalition in Sweden. An emerging market, Putin in Russia, Bolsonaro until recently in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey. The entire world is becoming less democratic and is macho, aggressive, because they're mostly men, by the way. Because when women are in power, like during COVID, which are the countries did better during COVID, were run by women. Taiwan, Finland, New Zealand, which are the worst they did, worst by macho men, UK, US, Brazil, right? So you have these macho guys who are aggressive, who are violent, authoritarian, becoming in power. And it's becoming more dangerous. The risk of war is bigger in societies that are populist, authoritarian, and aggressive. Why these people are becoming more populist? Unfortunately, liberal democracy has not been good for everybody. There's been a rise in income and wealth inequality. There's a rise of economic insecurity. People worry about their future, the future of their own children. This might be the first generation where the children are going to be worse off in terms of income and wealth, their own parents. And people, when they have this economic insecurity and there's a rise in inequality, they blame it on the elite, they blame it on the establishment. And in most of the world, is populism of the extreme right, say in Europe or in the US. But in some emerging markets like Latin America, they're going extreme left. Mexico, Peru, Colombia, until recently Argentina, Brazil. Everybody's becoming a populist of the left. Why? They tried the right wing, it didn't work for them, now they're going to extreme left. It's like a yo-yo, as you know, in Latin America. You go from extreme populist of the left to the right and back and forth and so on. But populism and authoritarian are on the rise. Even in the US, you could have the end of liberal democracy, depending on the results of the election. We should be worried about that. And as we know, these populist regimes are authoritarian, they're economic nationalists, they're against free trade, they're against Europe, they're against the European Union, they're against the euro, they're against migration, they're against free markets, they're against stuff. They want just to redistribute stuff to the people without even having the taxes to pay for it. So it leads usually to economic mess. Populism in Latin America has also led to inflation, hyperinflation, bankruptcy, and default. We're not yet there, but that's the trend. So backlash against liberal democracy. Are we going to live in authoritarian regimes? And which kind of authoritarian regimes? Final thing, and maybe I'll stop right there. We have to worry also about technological risks. Now, everybody today, what's the buzzword of the year? Gen AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic, automation. In principle, all these things could make the world better. We could live longer, healthier, we could become richer, productivity could be higher, potential growth could be higher. So the potential technology makes the world better. But even this technology carry huge amount of risk. One of them is, of course, with AI, the kind of misinformation, disinformation, deep fake, political and electoral manipulation already occurred in 2016 US. Now it's a different degree. 2016, they used Cambridge Analytica and big data to manipulate the election. 10 years later, you have something 10 times more sophisticated than what happened in 2016. This year will be the year where you can have a deep fake the day of the election where Biden is dropping dead and it's going to become viral before people go to the poll. Just to give you an example, literally viral, or anything else you can say, or you say something stupid, or Trump says something crazy. These things happening today, they could happen more and more. You also have a world in which there is cyber warfare. The enemies of the US and the West know that they are not powerful enough. Russia is not powerful enough. North Korea is not. Iran is not to win the war against the US with conventional, even one unconventional weapon. What can they use? Cyber. Very cheaply, you can have cyber attacks, disinformation, having attacks against government, against their websites, and the ones of corporation, and cause a huge amount of damage. It's called asymmetric warfare. If you cannot beat your enemy using conventional weapons, use unconventional ones like cyber. And the number of cyber attacks is becoming exponential. I was at a conference where the former head of the NSA spoke, National Security Agency of the US. He said the number of these cyber attacks is becoming just exponential all over the US, in Europe, everywhere around the world. And that's going to be with AI worse. You have a world that with AI, you could have permanent technological unemployment. Many jobs that are of blue collar and white collar, as long as they're not too skilled, could be wiped out over time gradually by technology. Middle value added, low value added. Let's forget for a moment about skills. So the prospect of permanent technological unemployment is a huge nightmare and is already starting slowly going in that direction. The level of income and wealth inequality will radically raise. We already live in a world in which the rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. Let's admit it. Whether it's technology, whether it's trade, whether it's globalization, whether it's power of elite, we don't know, but it's happening. But this technology increases inequality. Why? These technologies are capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving. So if you own the machine, the robot, or you own the capital owns the machine, so you have stocks into OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google, you're going to do better because you're going to earn the returns from them investing in robotic automation, machine learning. If you are in the top 10% distribution of skills, education, human capital, like I'm sure everybody's in this room, we're highly intelligent, skilled people. In all our jobs, AI initially is going to make us more productive. You are a composer musician. You're just saying AI is going to make actually more productive people who compose music because the shitty stuff can be done by the machine and you can do the creative stuff. Everybody can give an example where the AI is going to make them more productive in what they do. If you are a highly skilled worker. But if you are a low value added or medium value added, white collar, blue collar, your jobs and income is going to be disrupted by technology and you're not going to be able to use AI to make you better off. You're going to become worse off. Your job is going to become obsolete. You're not going to be able to reskill yourself to find another job. That's the risk of permanent technological employment and rise in income, wealth inequality. And income and wealth inequality leads to what? Social political instability, populism, people becoming angry and then becoming violent as we see. Final point on AI. Every time there is a technological revolution, people think about the civilian applications. But before the civilian applications, there's the military ones. The US jumbo jet, 747, started as a military project. The internet was started by DARPA, this is the technology agency of the US government. Before World War I, we built these new machines, the tanks, and we fought World War I. Before World War II, we had all these new fighter jets that led to even more advanced warfare. Before we had nuclear power, what we did, we created nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, we had to finish World War II by hitting, unfortunately, most sadly, Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese with the bomb. And then we had nuclear power. So every time you have a new technological evolution, it is used to build bigger weapons to fight bigger wars. And what's happening with AI? People talk about semi-autonomous or autonomous drones, semi-autonomous, autonomous weapon system. The wars of the future might not be fought by humans, but by robot soldiers. Today, what limits the risk of war is that nobody wants to die in Europe. No one wants to die in the US. So we don't want to have a war because ourselves, our children could die. But suppose you have a world in which you have robot soldiers fighting each other rather than humans, maybe it makes more likely that big powers want to fight a war. It's going to be fought by machines. Of course, the one who loses territory and everything, but the loss of life initially is not occurring. So war becomes actually more likely rather than likely. Now, I'm going to conclude by making the following observations. One, in the book I talk about these things, and I call them mega threats, economic, not economic, feeding on each other. Last year, the Financial Times chose as one of the buzzwords of the year the term polycrisis, not polyparty, polycrisis, okay? And polycrisis is exactly the idea that there are economic, non-economic factors feeding on each other that lead then to conflict and tension and uncertainty and violence and storms. The head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, called it a perma crisis. And Nobel Prize winners last year wrote a book called Perma Crisis. I presented my book at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, the big central bank of all central banks. And I had a discussion with the head of it, Kristalina Georgieva, who's a Bulgarian, who's now the head of the IMF. I was doomish. She said that we are facing what she called the confluence of calamities. Think about that alliteration, a confluence of calamities like we have not seen since World War II. I was in Davos, like I go every year, for the World Economic Forum. Right before the forum, the WEF publishes their global risk report. There's a report globally of the global risk. It was all about mega threats, polycrisis, economic and non-economic stuff feeding on each other. The point I'm making is that whether you're calling it mega threats or polycrisis or permacrisis or confluence of calamities or the most risky decade ahead of us since World War II, like the FF says, we live in a world that's unfortunately very dangerous. We're here, this paradise, we're eating well, we're doing yoga, we're connecting, finding peace, love, community, and so on. It's beautiful what we do, but the world out there, unfortunately, is burning. Now, for every problem, there is a solution. And in the book, it's not all doom and gloom, because for each one of these threats, I say, what are the policy solutions that avoid the disaster? Because all of these things feed on each other. The problem is that any solution implies making some sacrifices individually, collectively, nationally, globally, for the common good of us 10, 20 years from now, of our own children, other generation. And we live in a world in which selfishly, not just governments, people blame the government, but take individually. Ask you the following question. Each of us, of course, has to do something for climate change. How many of us own electric vehicle car? How many of us have insulated all our homes? How many of us have put solar panel above all our homes? How many of us are using public transportation rather than using private cars? How many of us try to reduce our carbon footprint by not flying as much around the world? How many of us go to the grocery store and decide to use reusable bags as opposed to disposable bags that are plastic that's just polluting the ocean? It's small sacrifice, but each of us, even those who would say, I care about the environment, they do very little of it because we're lazy and we think that if I do it, nobody else does, it doesn't make any difference, and therefore I'm not going to do it. But each one of these individual choices in billion collective implies a disaster. And then, of course, there are things that even if individuals do, if the country don't deal with climate change by having the policy to have net zero, you can do individually everything you want to. You can net zero individually, it's not going to make any difference. And we're not doing it at the national level, we're not doing it at the global level. So the question is, are there solutions to all these mega threats? Yes. But are we on a path where each of us individually collectively, in our community, in our country, globally, are doing the stuff to prevent them and resolve them? I fear not. And if we don't do it, we're going to end up into a disaster. That's a risk we're facing. So you have to warn about these things, not because you say doom is going to occur, but we've been living like zombies, all of us. Every time somebody sounds the alarm, you push the snooze button, you go back to sleep, pretending that doesn't exist. We sleepwalking into disaster like zombies. So I'm telling you, wake up, don't be a zombie, be aware, do it individually, tell your own government, tell in your parties, organize yourself, because if we don't do something right, we're going to end up in a very ugly place, because the world is dangerous, even if this is a paradise. So sorry for being a little bit depressing, but on June 21st, summer solstice, full moon, we have to hope for the better. But as they say, you have to hope for the better, but to prepare for the worst. And that's what we have to do individually. Be aware, because start to change is being aware. If you're not aware, you're like a psychotic. Psychotic deny that they have a problem. We're all neurotic, at least neurotic, know they have a problem, and they can start to address it. So let's stop the psychosis and let's try to address what we need to do. So that's my short, happy summary.